You're listening to the Thriving Neighborhoods podcast, where systems thinking meets lived experience in the work of community transformation. I'm Kirk Wester Rivera.
And I'm Marcos Wester Rivera.
Co-founders of Cerco Solutions, a consulting and advising company dedicated to helping social impact and community development organizations drive to greater impact. Every episode, we explore practical solutions for creating inclusively grown neighborhoods, covering housing, education, economic opportunity, community leadership, and more. Through conversations with expert practitioners and insights from decades in the field, we unpack what holistic neighborhood development actually looks like on the ground. All right, everyone, this is our first episode of the first real episode, I should say, of the Thriving Neighborhoods Lab podcast. And today we're diving into a question that's absolutely fundamental to this work. How did we get the neighborhoods that we have today? If you're working in community development, whether you're leading a community development organization, designing philanthropic strategy, or serving in local government, you've probably encountered neighborhoods where poverty seems to persist generation after generation, despite decades of investment. You've also likely seen beautiful new housing developments trigger displacement fears, or you've wondered why some communities seem to bounce back from economic downturns while others spiral deeper into distress. To understand these dynamics, we need to understand history. Not history as abstract academic exercise, but history as explanation for the very real conditions you're navigating right now in your community. In 2019, my guest today published a position paper that became, frankly, in my opinion, essential reading for anyone serious about neighborhood transformation. It was called Poverty in Place, and it synthesizes decades of research and policy history into a clear framework for understanding how concentrated neighborhood poverty actually works, and more importantly, why traditional interventions so often fall short. David Edwards wrote that paper while serving as CEO of Purpose-Built Communities, where he worked with communities across the country. One of those was mine, implementing his holistic revitalization strategies. Before that, he spent years in various roles bridging research, policy, and practice. Today, he serves as policy advisor for the city of Atlanta and director of the Center for Urban Research at Georgia Tech, where he's working to translate these insights into actual policy and practice. For me personally, David's paper is transformative. I had spent over a decade living and working in a disinvested and marginalized neighborhood, leading the effort of a community quarterback to create holistic transformation. I'd seen the patterns he described, the way poverty seemed to compound across generations, but the challenge of creating change that didn't displace the very people we were trying to serve was very difficult. But David's paper gave me language and framework for understanding the systemic forces I was experiencing on the ground. It also validated something I'd learned through proximity, that neighborhoods aren't just geographic locations where economically vulnerable people happen to live. They're environments that actively shape outcomes for better or worse. And that distinction matters enormously for how we approach this work. So without further ado, David, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Kirk. It's a pleasure to be here.
Man, I am so excited about today's conversation, and we shifted things around because I really wanted to kick off this podcast with this conversation, because I think I've shared this before. I remember when you gave us that paper at a Purpose-Built convening, and I was flying on the way back, and I was like, what is this thing? And I started reading it, and man, I think I highlighted half of that, and I was like, what's the point in highlighting at this point? There's been a very few moments where you're really struggling for language to explain something. And for me, that paper did that. And so I really appreciate it. But let's start with the paper itself. So you're running Purpose-Built Communities at the time, working with communities across the country on neighborhood transformation. You're not an academic who needs to publish to get tenure, right? So why did you feel compelled to write Poverty in Place? I mean, it was a heavy body of work. And what problem were you trying to solve with that paper?
Well, I said that, the immediate problem from Purpose-Built perspective was that, we were in the business of trying to convince philanthropists, political leaders, civic leaders that the problem we were facing in this intergenerational poverty is a problem of place. And all of our systems are set up as if it's a problem of solely of people. And it occurred to me after several years of trying to make that case and trying to persuade folks that we needed to look at these issues through the lens of place, that we needed to put in one place how all the research really is supporting the pivot towards place. And so that was really what instigated my, and I wrote that very quickly, because this is this was work that I had been, all this research I'd been familiar with. It was in my PowerPoint presentations, et cetera. But I really felt like it needed to be sort of in one place that we could socialize and publish. So that was really what provoked the writing of the paper.
Well, it definitely humbles me to know that you wrote that very quickly, because it was, and obviously I know it built out of a whole host of work that you'd already been doing, and I'm sure you had refined it over many years of speaking about it. But one of the things that struck me about your paper was how it functions as both a history lesson and a diagnostic tool. I mean, you're essentially saying, if you don't understand how we got here, you'll keep making the same mistakes. So talk about that connection between understanding history and designing effective interventions that was so prevalent in that piece of work.
Well, one of the reasons why it's frustrating that people have failed to connect this issue with place is that when you actually go back and look at the history, it's so clearly a geographic problem. And I'm sure many of your listeners today have read Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. But if you read that book, you clearly see that it was a set of public policies going back. You can go back as far as you want, but he particularly focuses on sort of the Depression era and post-war period, where we made very specific decisions as a society to concentrate poverty in very specific places and to segregate our cities using a whole array of mechanisms in housing, education policy, and other policies that really was deliberately trying to create the kind of disparate impacts that we now see today. And so that history, to me, is clearly needs to be understood so that we can reposition and rethink through the problem as a problem of place. And it's, in other words, unless we address this legacy of place-based discrimination that went on for so many years, we're never going to get to the solution to this problem. And the other piece of this, and which I do talk about in that paper as well, is if you look at what our response to that history has been, and so you could really, the triggering moment for that was Johnson's declaration of war on poverty in 1964. That was the first real sort of organized attempt to address that legacy. And his goal, as he states very clearly in his inauguration speech, was to eliminate poverty. It wasn't to ameliorate the impacts of poverty. He wanted to eliminate poverty. And that's a huge difference. But the programs and the policies that came out of that were all, again, people-based approaches. There were food stamps and housing vouchers and aid to families with dependent children. And it was all very much about how do we create a safety net for people. And the conceit there, the thinking was that, well, if you could just give folks and protect folks from the worst consequences of poverty, they'll be able to invest in themselves and create a prosperous future for themselves and their families. And that has really been the motivating factor behind not only the federal government's programs, but state governments, local governments, and philanthropy and nonprofits since that time. And it's a very clear line from the war on poverty to today. My estimate is over 95% of the resources we put on poverty and fighting poverty in this country is dedicated to people-based programs and initiatives. So it's still not, and it has not moved towards a place-based approach. And that's really what we think is needed to if we're ever going to actually make progress on this problem.
No, that history is super helpful. And I think so often we don't recognize kind of what the intentions were behind it. And you really articulated this kind of theory of change that, really was trying to eradicate poverty, but at the end of the day, they still kind of defaulted to the individual kind of impact. What would you say that that was learned from this approach? Like, what did we miss?
Well, I mean, there are two big threads to the kind of, if you think about root causes of this challenge of intergenerational poverty, and I tend to focus on urban poverty. I think rural poverty has a different set of causes, but certainly urban poverty, which in many ways is what dominates the kind of public conversation around these challenges, is what's happening in our cities. There's really two big pieces of, I think, insights and research that have been done in the last 25 years or so that I think should be informing our thinking about this work. The first is the Robert Sampson's work in Chicago around the impact of concentrated poverty on what he he had called collective efficacy, which is really the kind of social cohesion that we all rely on in our lives to advance our interests and the interests of our family and our children. Just the connectivity that we as social beings need in order to be successful in life and to flourish. And his research really showed that how that the dynamics of these neighborhoods of concentrated poverty really undermine collective efficacy and therefore impeded our ability to improve the lives of folks who live in those conditions. So I think that, and there's a whole thread of work that's followed that all the way up to Raj Chetty's work today, is that it's all part of that same thread about how the social dynamics in these communities have been undermined through the fact that we've concentrated poverty in this way. The second big piece of work I would say that gets to root causes is the stuff that Jack Schonkop at Harvard and others have focused on in terms of childhood development and how children growing up in these distressed communities are exposed to all these sources of toxic stress is the technical term, but it's a whole basket of things we're talking about in terms of exposure to crime and violence, housing instability, environmental contaminants, ambient air temperature differences. In Atlanta, our red line neighborhoods have an 8-degree higher temperature in the summer than our non-red line neighborhoods. Noise issues. There's a whole list of what we now call place-based social determinants that really directly impact the health of children, and specifically in their neurological and physiological development. And so Jack and the folks in that space of childhood development have really done an excellent job of both understanding those impacts and quantifying them. And so the combination of those two, those drivers, I would say, of intergenerational poverty are what I think we ought to be focusing on and understanding, so that our responses are focused effectively on those root causes.
Yeah, and you mentioned this idea of toxic stressors, and just for the listeners, we'll be interviewing Dr. Douglas Judy in the next episode to kind of expound on that, because it's really a profound kind of discovery and body of work that I think just has tremendous promise for how we understand both not only how to think about this work, but also how to where are we going to get the most return on our investments, because we do have an issue of how we have limited resources, and how do we invest those in the most impactful way, and just thinking about kids. But I'm also thinking about as we start to understand those biological mechanisms, what I'm also hearing though is that neighborhoods aren't just addresses. They're environments that are either buffering or amplifying stress for developing children and families. And that has profound implications for how we think about intervention strategies, because it suggests that stacking individual services isn't enough if the environment itself remains toxic. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely. And the sort of the shorthand for that is we're not going to services our way out of this problem. But that has been the predominant approach. Almost everything we've done really since the war on poverty started. And if you look at the war on poverty's programs, they're all services related, right? So we've had this assumption that we could deliver services, whether they be education services, health services, food security services, all of these things that you do, this whole basket of interventions. But somehow that combination of those and first of all, we started off with the assumption that each one of those interventions would generate outcomes, and then we got to this collective impact model where we thought, well, we just package these services together, we'll get better outcomes. But
which, by the way, is usually only in a single sector as well.
Exactly, and but certainly we've concluded that neither one of those, either point solutions nor collective impact of services, actually generate the change. What we really need to do is change the fundamental conditions of these neighborhoods, and that's mostly a capital set of investments. And the reason why it's a capital set of investments is because what we really are trying to construct here are self-sustaining, healthy, thriving neighborhoods. And that is a neighborhood is the system. That's what we're trying to impact. And it's not going to be something that government is going to be constantly nurturing. That where you've got to create the conditions that are self-sustaining. And anybody, and I'm sure many of the people who are listening to this podcast live in self-sustaining, healthy neighborhoods. And I can assure you, there are no nonprofits or even government that's spending their time worrying about whether your neighborhood is continuing to be healthy. It has its own momentum to be healthy. It's got a virtuous cycle of investment. It's really what it comes down to. Private dollars are coming into your neighborhood. People are moving into your neighborhood. Businesses are moving in your neighborhood, and they are working in a symbiotic way to promote and sustain the health of your neighborhood. In these distressed neighborhoods, you got the opposite dynamic. They're in a vicious cycle of disinvestment, where people aren't living in these, moving and investing in these neighborhoods because there aren't services and businesses and grocery stores and the things that people need. And the businesses won't come to that neighborhood because there aren't the people and the spending power to support them. So what these capital investments do is intended to reverse that cycle of disinvestment by sending a signal basically to the marketplace, both marketplace in terms of business and marketplace in terms of people, say this is a healthy, thriving place. Come invest here. And that's why when you the purpose-built model is, I think, a perfect example, but there are others out there that says you got to do these investments at scale. They are big. They are cross domains: education, health, public infrastructure, economic development. You got to do it all at once. You got to do it all in kind of a coordinated way in conjunction with the neighborhoods and the leadership of those neighborhoods to really reverse this cycle of disinvestment and create help.
And I want to pinpoint a comment that you made, just so that we are defining the word the same. So that we really need to do these investments at scale. What I hear you saying is that we're doing them at a scale that matters. In other words, it's not, so for the sake of housing, it's not like 10 housing units, but we're talking about something at a scale that matters, but also the other piece of that is within a geographic boundary that can be contained. And
that's exactly right.
That there's that kind of, there's that container by which we can have compounding effects.
And that is, again, another example of how this work runs counter to the systems in which we're trying to operate, because it's very hard, for example, for city government or school systems or economic development agencies to focus their resources on single individual neighborhoods. The political infrastructure is set up not to advance that, because almost every city feels committed to spreading out investments, spreading out wealth. And so everything gets done at a very thin level around a city. And when you have to go to a mayor and say, no, that's not the right way to do it, what you need to do is take that same amount of money, but concentrate it in a handful of neighborhoods, you get some real pushback on that, right? And so that
it's designed for parity, right? I mean, it's designed for,
exactly. Everything is designed for
democratic systems designed for parity, because the minute you do that, the city councilor from the other side is saying, hey, what about my neighborhood? And so, it bootstraps us to kind of essentially never get to a finish line. Mediocrity becomes the norm.
And it undermines your ability to do anything at scale. I mean, because everything's got to be spent. Yeah.
So this kind of brings me to another critical question, kind of coming back to a little bit of, you mentioned Richard Rothstein, and so I think that this is good segue into kind of this other critical piece is, how did we get neighborhoods with these toxic environmental conditions in the first place? I mean, because you make it very clear in the paper, and that was one of the things that I think was so profound for me, that gave me the language of helping to explain. Obviously, at the same time, Richard's book had just The Color of Law book had just come out, I think within a couple of years of the time your paper came out, but it was relatively all the same. So these were converging kind of bodies of work. But you make very clear in the paper that this didn't happen by accident. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, absolutely. Well, the first thing to remember, and I think some people kind of lose sight of this, is that every neighborhood in every city was healthy and thriving at one point. Unhealthy neighborhoods are not built from scratch, right? Every neighborhood starts in a healthy condition. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist, right? So that's the first thing to remember. And so there was a whole series of things that happened, some of which I would say were sort of targeted to undermine the health of neighborhoods, but other things were just changes in the world that helped to impact the health of neighborhoods. So the example of the latter would be things like the introduction of the automobile in the early part of the last century. What that did was it meant that wealthier folks who could afford that kind of transportation could live farther and farther away from the center of their cities. So there was a flight out of these cities. I live in a neighborhood that's a perfect example of it, where this was a very prosperous, thriving city for fairly wealthy folks back in the early part of the century. But as soon as the automobile came in place, they all started moving north, farther away from downtown, farther away from the environmental challenges the industrial challenges the many downtowns had. And it took out a huge amount of the spending power that was once in this neighborhood. And so that's an example of just sort of, and it's not as if the automobile was intended to destroy neighborhoods. It just had that impact. So there's a whole set of, I think, those kinds of phenomena that occurred over the course of the last century that has undermined the health of neighborhoods. But there was also very specific policies, some of which I've already touched on. But certainly the building of highway systems, when the Eisenhower put through the Highway Construction Acts in the 1950s, began putting large dollars into those. It was quite deliberately, the highways were quite deliberately built through what was considered to be slum neighborhoods, even though they were in many ways healthy, thriving African-American neighborhoods. And I am within a stone's throw distance of Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, which was at the time become the most thriving African-American commercial center in the country. And they built a highway right through the middle of it. And so those kinds of policies certainly had a huge impact. Our public housing, and another example, I think, of a well-intended but ultimately deeply unhelpful policy was the way that we built public housing in this country. We started building, and in fact, Atlanta is another example. It was the first public housing complex in the country. It was built in Atlanta in Techwood Homes, and the thinking at the time was that, well, let's just build these housing developments in big super blocks and without any kind of mixed uses. So they were strictly residential areas. And they ended up evolving into centers of dysfunction, and so, to the point at which in many cities, and Atlanta being one of them, we're in the process of tearing them all down and recognizing that those were not helpful, both from a human perspective, but also just from a city and urbanist perspective. They just weren't designed to be effective elements of cities, and they really disconnected themselves. They were designed to be disconnected from the city. In fact, we're redeveloping a property here at Bowen Homes. That's a 75-acre former public housing project that had one entrance into it when it was functioning as a public housing. 75 acres with a single entrance, and that was done deliberately to prevent the residents of that public housing from being able to be connected to their surrounding neighborhoods. So we did things very deliberately.
You don't even do that in buildings. To have a single entrance and exit.
Exactly. Well, I mean, So there's a whole, there's stuff in education policy. If you look at the New York Times, and I'm sure it's still up there, the New York Times a few years ago put together a tool that you go look at how elementary schools are zoned by race in this country. And you'll see how attendance zones for elementary schools are very clearly aligned with racial compositions of neighborhoods. And that, here we are, 2025, that continues to persist. So this is not ancient history. We still have policies and practices in place that are continuing to segregate our cities and to concentrate poverty in certain geographies.
And the irony of that, just kind of to go down a rabbit trail just for a second, I mean, the irony of that is there's quite a bit of evidence of how powerful integrated schools are for children from all races. I mean, it particularly for middle-income white kids that are essentially going to mixed race schools, integrated schools. They show higher expressions of empathy, lower, significantly diminished expressions of racism, greater social emotional intelligence. I mean, the irony is we're literally robbing ourselves oftentimes by behaving these segregated ways from the benefits that integration can really cause. And I've seen that over and over again, even in our own family, in our own lives, in our own kids, that at the end of the day, the positive impact that raising our kids in a community that was very diverse is just, I can't even speak to the value of that.
I couldn't agree more, but it raises a really tricky question. So let me go down a rabbit hole here for a second, because I think
Sure.
Point, Kirk. So just to give to as an illustration of the point you just made, there's a school here called Burgess Peterson Academy, which serves two neighborhoods in Atlanta, Reynoldstown and East Atlanta. And in 2011, Burgess Peterson Academy had about 250 kids in it, almost all Black kids and almost all low incomes, 90% low income kids. And it was one of the lowest performing elementary schools in the system and in the bottom quintile of the state. So the state of Georgia has 1,248 elementary schools, and this school was in the bottom quintile at that time. You flash forward to today, in 2023, those neighborhoods have been completely revitalized, and it's as a consequence of some nonprofit and sort of community quarterback that works in that area, but also because of some public investments, not most importantly, the Beltline, which you have seen. The Beltline runs through these neighborhoods. And so these neighborhoods have been revitalized. The cycle of disinvestment has been reversed in those neighborhoods. People are moving in those neighborhoods. Businesses are opening in those neighborhoods. It's no longer a food desert. There's a Kroger or grocery store in this neighborhood. It's everything. You go to these neighborhoods now and you say, well, these are healthy, thriving places. Well, here's what's happened at the school. The school's enrollment has doubled. So it's gone from 250 to 500. So the school was half empty before. It's now 50% white, 50% black. So it's a fully integrated school now. The low-income black kids at that school now perform, and depending on which score you're looking at, either 2 or 3 times better than the low-income black kids do than they were doing in 2011 at that school, and the low-income black kids across the APS system wide. 2 to 3 times better. Now that is a remarkable improvement. I mean, in fact, I spent a lot of time working with public schools, and if they get a 5% improvement, they're usually handing out awards to each other, right? This is 100 and 200% improvement, and it's almost entirely attributable to the changes in the conditions in those neighborhoods. Those kids are now going to living in healthy neighborhoods, and when they show up to school, they're in a much better position to take advantage of what goes on inside school. So that's, to me, the exact example that I think we need to look at. However, the question is, and we're having these debates here in a major way, is such a racial diverse school sustainable? I mean, how do you ensure? It's one thing to go from really 100% black to 50% black and white, but then how do you manage? Let's just assume that that's where you want it to stay. How do you keep it that way? It's a real challenge, because the trend line would say, well, it's going to continue to get whiter and get less black, because that's where the lines have been going, right? The question is, from a public policy perspective and from a nonprofit perspective, what are the things that we should be doing to protect the accessibility of that neighborhood, particularly for low-income black kids in Atlanta, which is obviously the target demo here, so that you just don't gentrify away those neighborhoods and you end up 10 or 15 years from now where it's 100% white kids in that school and the black kids are gone. And that's the real risk that I think we all face. And how do you when this looks like success, but success needs to be sustainable in a way that protects the accessibility.
Yeah, I mean, it's curious too, because I think ultimately, not to belabor this point, because I know it's a little bit off topic of the subject, but I think it's an important one to kind of think through. Oftentimes it's really dependent upon, what you can really convince the value proposition is those white families. And what I mean by that is what we saw, because they're the ones that typically have the power to move or do something different. And they're the typically ones that go and leave, before anybody else does. And this is how these communities were often made the way they were, through white flight and otherwise. What I've seen happen, I think, is a kind of a slightly different take, which is one of the ways that we really attracted a mixed race kind of school system was by creating a service that was highly desired, which in our case was there was not enough dual language immersion to go around. And so the only dual language schools available were in highly white areas and almost dominated 100% by white students. But then all of a sudden, when you start to create those within a majority Latino neighborhood, you've now created this path that says, like, it basically, I guess the way I describe it is it chips away at the perceived risk of investing your kid there. And so therefore, and then once they're there, they realize actually there wasn't a risk at all. It's actually incredibly profound to my kid. And so there's this kind of psychology, I guess, or sociological psychology, I guess, I don't know what I'd say, like a scaled psychology, if you will, a community psychology that comes into place that I think really plays an important role in all this. But so the practical implication here, I think we're getting at is the practical implications are profound. So if segregation and concentrated poverty were created by deliberate policy choices, then we can't just rely on market forces or individual interventions to undo them, but we need equally intentional policy interventions. But here's where I'd say it kind of gets complicated, right? Is that because when we do start to see investments and improvements in historically disinvested neighborhoods, we face the displacement challenge, right? You wrote about this tension around what some have called kind of positive gentrification. But talk about what we've learned from our efforts to revitalize neighborhoods without displacing existing residents. Because that to me always feels like, I don't know about you, but anytime I talk about revitalizing communities, the first pushback I get is like, are you concerned about gentrification? Which I believe is a false choice. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this idea of how we do this work without displacing existing residents.
Well, the first thing that I think we've got to be very disciplined about the terminology we're using. So, we've been very careful in both when I was at Purpose Built and certainly the work I'm doing now in Atlanta to distinguish between gentrification and revitalization. When you talk about revitalization and you spend time in these neighborhoods, everything that the residents of these neighborhoods say they want, grocery stores, safer streets, better schools, better public infrastructure. These are all things that are required to revitalize a neighborhood. So they're asking to be revitalized. They want businesses. They want
that everybody wants. Yeah,
exactly. These are just the things that everyone wants. They want jobs. They want all the things that healthy neighborhoods automatically provide. So the goal is to create revitalized neighborhoods that are self-sustaining, as I said earlier, and that requires some sort of a private sector response. Gentrification occurs and there's really three elements of gentrification that we specifically have identified and are trying to measure and are trying to address. The first is one we've already talked about, which is what we call direct displacement. So when existing residents of these neighborhoods are feeling housing cost pressures, and that's what it really comes down to, whether it be increase in rents or increase in property taxes as a consequence of the increase in the values of properties there. What are you doing to help keep those folks in place? And so we have programs around literally paying property tax increments for residents who qualify so that they don't feel those direct pressures and feel the need to leave the neighborhood. We also do financial literacy programs, and we do titlings to make sure that so many of these residents in these neighborhoods don't have proper titles to their properties, or they don't have the wills in place so that when they pass away, these properties don't pass on to their descendants. So there's those families of, I think, services that you can do to make sure that the existing residents can stay in the neighborhood as it changes. But that in fact is an important problem, but it's also a temporary problem, right? Because those existing residents won't be there forever. Right? People are moving or people are dying. Right? That's the way life works, right? So that's almost like a transitory initiatives, right? The second piece is accessibility. So it's one thing to protect existing residents, but it's also important to make sure that future low-income residents can come into this neighborhood. And the way that the really only effective way to do that is to make sure that you are providing housing at all levels of income levels. And so in Atlanta, the mayor has committed to building 20,000 affordable housing units in the city. And what we are directing almost all of that energy to these neighborhoods that we're working in, such that those neighborhoods will have what I would call a floor of affordability forever. So that it'll always be a segment of housing that will be accessible to low-income people, regardless of what else happens in that neighborhood. So that to me is the key to protecting accessibility in the neighborhood.
Doing that at scale, like you described earlier.
Doing it at scale.
Having that floor at a scale that matters.
And the good thing is, we know how to build affordable housing. That's not, that's one of the things the government can do. And when we have, it's just a question of will and resources. But that is something that government actually can do, and it can do effectively. The third piece, which is in fact I think the hardest nut to crack in this, and that has to do with cultural displacement. How do you keep these neighborhoods in such a way that the folks who live in them today, and really folks who may want to come live in the future, feel welcome and continue to feel like they're part of the community? And that has to do largely with making sure that the neighborhoods themselves steward these transformations, and that they're in a position to affect what kinds of businesses come into these neighborhoods, how these investments are made from a sort of a stylistic and architectural perspective to maintain a certain presence in the neighborhood, investing in cultural institutions and arts institutions to make sure that these neighborhoods can protect. Now this is not something you can't freeze a neighborhood in place culturally. All neighborhoods are constantly in some set of flux and moving, and that's just the way the world works. But there are things you can do, and I live close to a neighborhood called Little Five Points that has always been, really since the 50s, kind of the funky tattooed parlor kind of place that is.
With a name like Little Five Points, it's got to be.
Exactly. But the neighborhoods around Little Five Points have completely transformed from the time they were in the 50s. But Little Five Points has sustained that cultural kind of position, mostly because the business owners and the landowners there made a very specific decision that they were going to continue to protect that culture, and they didn't allow chain restaurants in there. There are no drive-through restaurants there. They've been very careful about how they program those businesses. So it clearly can be done, but it does take an effort and has to be deliberate.
Well, it reminds me of a comment one of my colleagues made when I was doing my work. Is he said, at the end of the day, the people that live here have to see themselves in the retail spaces, and there's it provides that. In our case, it was like if a majority Latino neighborhood has to go 3 miles outside this neighborhood to get to a supermercado or panaderia, like, why would they stay here, right? And so it becomes what I would describe as trying to make it really hard for people to want to leave, because they feel such a sense of connectedness and belonging. Going back to the Sampson work of that cohesion, right? It all comes down to a sense of belonging, sense of ownership, that this is really kind of where we see ourselves. And then, the true testament to that, to be honest, is that the kids of those parents grow up, become economically successful, and choose to purchase a house within that same neighborhood and raise their own kids there, right? And like that's the indicator of success long term, I suppose, is that you continue. There's that such a sense of belonging that they see value in that for the long term. So going in a little bit as we kind of wrap up. So you're now in a position where you can actually help shape policy and practice in Atlanta, one of the country's most dynamic but most challenged cities in terms of affordability, displacement. Without going too deep, because honestly, I hope to have you back for a full episode on this particular subject, because what you're doing there and what your colleagues are doing there, and Purpose Built's doing there, and the mayor's doing there, is just truly profound. And I know I am not alone in saying I'm waiting on bated breath to see how this plays out, because it could be a huge game changer. But talk briefly about what you're trying to accomplish and how the insights from just even this Poverty in Place paper are informing your approach. I know you touched a little bit on some of the policy things, but just if you can try to just give an overview of what you guys are trying to accomplish there, and again, how some of these things that we've talked about so far are informing that the approach that the city's taking.
Well, I think Atlanta, is a really good case study in a lot of ways. I mean, Atlanta has these persistent equity gaps, and just like most cities do. But Atlanta is, if you look at Atlanta's history, we have had Black leadership since Maynard Jackson was elected in the early 70s. In fact, I think we have the longest stretch of Black mayors of any major city in the country. We are the cradle of the civil rights movement. We are where the civil rights movement was really planned and executed out of Atlanta. We have this reputation, a tagline of a city too busy to hate, which was kind of a shortcut way of saying Black political leadership and the white business community work together to do big things. Bringing the Olympics here was sort of a great example of that.
The home of Martin Luther King. I mean,
exactly.
Doesn't get any more profound than that.
And I personally known every mayor, all of those mayors, starting with Maynard Jackson. I've known them personally, and I know they were all committed to improving equity in the city, and yet really no progress has been made. And so it raises the real question. So how can that be? How is it that we are still in the same place, really, quite literally, in terms of the size of our equity gaps here are no smaller than they were in 1970. And what we've concluded, and now we have a mayor, I think, who is the first mayor to fully realize this, is that it's the reason we still have this problem is because that we haven't been defining the problem properly. And it goes back to this problem of people versus the problem of place. And so Mayor Andre Dickens here in Atlanta, to his credit, when he got elected 4 years ago, he said the eliminating of racial equity gaps in the city of Atlanta is going to be my central strategic imperative. Those are his words, and he has been convincing both the philanthropic community and the rest of local government, including the schools, the housing authority, the economic development authority, all the players that you think that you really need to do this kind of work at scale. He has done just a fantastic job of getting them aligned around this work. And what that really means, Kirk, is that this is systems change at its most profound. We're basically saying, and what the mayor is saying to these agencies is that the health of neighborhoods isn't this extra thing that you should be focused on.
It is the thing.
It is the thing.
Yeah.
It is what government produces is healthy neighborhoods. That's our product. Everything else is in service of that goal. And we need to start making capital decisions and operating decisions in reflection of that reality. And so so we are moving a very big ship gradually towards that goal. There's a lot that has to happen in order for that not only to happen in the short term, but to kind of a permanent reorientation towards that goal. And so that's what's exciting to me about this. And that's why I eagerly accepted his offer to come join his team in the mayor's office, because it seemed to me that this is the kind of thing. I mean, as you know, when I was at Purpose Built, I spent a lot of time trying to talk to mayors and even governors at points to say, this is the way that you should be approaching this problem. But to have a mayor in Atlanta willing to take this on in such a deep and profound way is so gratifying. And I'm just humbled to be able to be part of that. And I am as waiting as bated breath like you are to see how this all turns out. But I'm saying it's exciting, and we just have leaders here like Courtney English and others who have really just taken this on and said, Courtney is the mayor's chief of staff and has really been the engine of this, and you know him very well. And so, but we have just a bunch of civic leaders who are saying, we're going to make this happen. And that's just so exciting.
I mean, I can't tell you how just profound it is that, because sometimes, mayors will make this choice and declaration, and you can tell that, there's not a lot of optimism around it because the people around them or the people that are critical partners just aren't speaking the same language. But I don't hear that. I hear quite the opposite, is that, every time I've touched base with somebody in Atlanta, it just seems like there's a movement happening, which is quite profound. And I just want to be clear, though, what you guys are really saying is that you go big by going small. Like, you attack the right scale, and you do that scale at such a depth that you're able to then leverage the benefits of that to then move on to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. It's like creating a domino effect, if you will, of social change, and ultimately leads to a thriving neighborhood where kids can grow up. Because I think that was the other piece of it, right? Is centering on how do you make this one of the greatest cities for kids to grow up.
And I think it's worth just to put because I think the way you've described it is helpful, Kirk, but just to put the context around is nationally. So I did some math on this a while back. I think that's actually in that paper, but this is a very solvable problem. I mean, I did some calculations. This is 10 years ago or whatever, that there are about 800 of what we call distressed urban neighborhoods in this country. 800 of them. And Purpose Built, it's working in 60 or 70 of them. That's a pretty big chunk that one nonprofit is working in. So 800 neighborhoods. And so doing them actually, if you have to do them one at a time, they're all different and they're all unique, as you say. But the fact is, if we were as a society to decide to take this on, we could easily do it. In fact, I did the math on just the cost to do these neighborhoods. And I think the number was, if we spent 4% of one annual federal budget, not ongoing, just one, which is, and I used to work at OMB in Washington, and I can tell you 4% of an annual federal budget is pretty much, just a accounting error, right? I mean, it's rounding error. It's basically the numbers we're talking about. But if we were to do that one time, we would be able to address all 800 of those neighborhoods and fundamentally change the trajectory on all of these outcomes that we care about, whether it be education outcomes, health outcomes, economic mobility outcomes. So this is not a money issue. This is a leadership issue. This is and this is why I go back to what we started with, is the reason why this is so hard really is to get folks out of the people-based business and into the place-based business, because that's ultimately what it's going to take. That's the real barrier. It's not about money. It's not even really about expertise. It's really about leadership.
And I think there's a clarifying point there, though, that is important, because I think oftentimes the challenges I've seen with community quarterbacks is that when you say place-based business, they focus mostly just on the infrastructure, and they oftentimes forget about the impact that they're having on people. But you're basically saying it's place in it to serve as a means to the end, which is ultimately impacting people. It's basically what is the means, and is what you're describing, not the ends.
And it's place-based social determinants. I think that term is very helpful, because it's the social determinants that you care about. It's the people. But
ultimately, it's about impacting the people. That people ultimately have better outcomes as a result. But you're attacking it from, rather than a service delivery system, it's around an ecosystem.
My daughter wrote
the conditions.
When she was applying for college a couple of years ago, she wrote an essay. Didn't even tell me about it until she submitted it, and it was about how her neighborhood impacted her growing up. And it kind of, and I don't cheer.
Despite her dad.
It wasn't about how great her great parenting. It was about the impact of her neighborhood, and it was a really touching piece, because because she was talking about things that I hadn't really understood that she was going through, but the way that her neighborhood affected her growing up in such positive ways. I think we take that for granted, and for those of us who live in these kind of healthy neighborhoods, but these are absolutely fundamental impacts on our kids, and we have a huge swath of our society that kids are not getting that benefit, and that's the problem we need to solve.
No, agreed. Well, David, this has been incredibly valuable, and just for listeners who want to read Poverty in Place, and I really encourage you to do so. I know there's been a lot of learning since then, but it's still incredibly powerful and say just thought-provoking, but we'll have a link for that in the show notes. I continue to contend it's essential reading for anyone serious about understanding the systemic context of neighborhood development work. I want to thank you very much for taking the time to walk us through this history and these insights. I couldn't think of a better person to do this, frankly, and I know you and I have had dozens of conversations around this, and so anytime I can get the opportunity to extend that that privilege to other folks, I just find definitely worth pushing in on. The work you've done to synthesize decades of research and experience into kind of frameworks that practitioners can actually use is just frankly invaluable, and it's so important for us to give words to like what we're experiencing and what we know to be true, right? Because I know for me and many others, it just really aligns with what our lived experience is telling us. But oftentimes we can't explain it. And so that's going to be the critical piece for us going forward is, can we explain this well to people that are in the decision-making seats to understand how we get to over the finish line? But thank you so much.
Well, it was a pleasure, obviously. And I'm really excited about the work you're doing, Kirk, and absolutely excited about this podcast series that you're developing. I'm eagerly awaiting the future episodes, and I'd be happy to come back at some point to continue these conversations.
Consider it noted. Well, in closing, for everyone listening, our next episode, we're going to build on this foundation by exploring the neuroscience of place in much greater depth. We'll talk to Dr. Doug Judy about how childhood experiences, particularly the stress environments that David referenced today, actually shape brain architecture and long-term outcomes. That conversation will help us understand not just why neighborhoods matter, but the precise biological mechanisms through which neighborhood conditions get, quote, under the skin and affect development. If you found today's conversation valuable, share it with the community quarterbacks, funders, and civic leaders in your network who are grappling with these questions. This is exactly the kind of systemic understanding that needs to spread in our field. Thanks for listening. I'm Kirk Wester Rivera, and this is the Thriving Neighborhoods Lab podcast. Thanks for listening to the Thriving Neighborhoods podcast. If today's conversation sparked something for you, we'd love to hear about it. Connect with us on LinkedIn or visit us at cerca.solutions, that's CERCA.solutions, to learn more about how we support community quarterbacks and organizations committed to high-impact efforts. And if you found value in this episode, please share it with someone else working towards thriving communities. Every conversation moves us closer to the change we need. Thanks for listening. I'm Kirk Wester Rivera.
And I'm Marcos Wester Rivera.
And this has been the Thriving Neighborhoods Podcast. We'll see you next time.